Hi, I'm Renee with the Fibre Co, and this is the first tutorial video for the Fibre Co One Sock Knit Along. In this series, we will be taking you through all the techniques needed to knit your very first sock using our One Sock pattern. You can get the pattern, which is sized from newborn baby to adult, and our sock yarn Amble by visiting our website or by asking for the One Sock pattern and Amble yarn at your local yarn store. Let's get started. Let's look at some of the different needle setup options for sock knitting. First, we have the DPN, or double pointed needle, named for obvious reasons. You'll be using several needles to knit in the round with this technique, but I always cast on regardless of the needle setup over one single needle. And then I transfer the stitches. We sort of have to redistribute those stitches like this, just simply passing them purlwise from one needle to the next. And when I have the correct number, depending on how many I'm working over, evenly divided by 3 or 4, depending on if I'm using 3 needles with 1 needle to knit across each one, or 4 needles and 1 needle to knit across each one. Then I am going to evenly transfer those around the working needles, and I'm going to finish doing that and then show you how I work across each one. I've redistributed my stitches over 3 needles now, and I'm ready to start knitting with the 4th. I want to make sure I do not start knitting with the tail. I've done that so many times I can't tell you, but only with the working yarn. And with the working yarn, the first stitch that we're going to knit to kind of close the circuit is this one right here. So we want to get this stitch as close as possible to the last stitch on the sort of working yarn, and so I'm going to close the gap by holding that as close as possible. The first round is always a bit awkward, and it's a bit fiddly, and it gets easier from this point on. So I'm going to knit that first stitch, and then I'm going to make sure I pull it extra tight so that it's as close as it can get to that last stitch. I'm going to work a 1x1 rib to start, so my next stitch will be a purl stitch. And I'm going to work like that all the way across, and then I'll jump back with you and show you how to redistribute your needles again. Okay, I've reached the last stitch on my needle, and that's a knit stitch in pattern, and then this is my new free stitch, my new free needle, and I'm going to just slide my needles around so that it's then easy for me to work the next needle. So with my newly emptied needle, I'm going to again just work in 1x1 rib pattern across this one, and that creates my first round finished. Double pointed needles are a traditional way of small circular knitting, but there are other options as well. This is a set of 3 short circulars, they're called. There's a cable between 2 tips on a relatively small space, and the arrangement looks a little bit like this. So when you're knitting across, you have your 2 halves of the knitting, and you're just going to work across the first half with your spare needle, and then the second half of the spare needle. And it doesn't matter which hand you knit with, it's the same process there. When you get to the end of the row, you've basically transferred all the stitches from one needle to the next, and you've freed up your first needle. So then you just turn your work over, push the needle that's holding those stitches about to be knit back in, and then with your free needle you're going to start knitting across those. And so that's another way of working those small circular forms. My personal favorite is the magic loop method, which uses a really long circular needle. Make it longer than you might think you need it to be. And if you find that you cast on quite tightly, a top tip is to cast on over 2 needles. And I'll just show you how I do that with a long tail cast on. Here, I'll make a little slip knot and pop that over my needle and make it fit. And then work my normal long tail cast on, but instead of 1 needle, I have 2. So it'll have that much more yarn. And I'll show you, once I'm finished with the cast on, how I work my first round. I've cast on the number of stitches required, and now I'm going to remove 1 of the needles from the pair, and then pull all these stitches into the middle of my cable. All right, and once they're there, I'm going to fold it in half and pull the center of my cable out from the middle of those stitches. Okay, so here's the middle of my cable. Here's the middle of my stitches, my first stitch, my working yarn coming from my last stitch. Just like with the other methods, I have cast on over a single needle, and now I have to kind of arrange my needles so that I'm able to work that first stitch with my working yarn and keep that very close. We want that working yarn as close as it can be to that first stitch. So I know that I need to push this needle into this half of my stitches, and the only other needle I have to work is with this one. So I arrange them really close together in my hands and do not work with my tail, but the working yarn, I knit that first stitch and then I pull it nice and tight. And I'm working my 1x1 rib for the cuff, so I'm going to purl that next stitch, and again I'm going to pull it tight. There's still going to be a gap there, just a little gap that'll close over the few rounds that we work at the beginning, but that's okay, don't worry about it, don't worry about the gap. I'm just going to work my 1x1 rib all the way across, and then when I get to the end I'll show you how I rearrange the needles again. Okay, I'm at the end of my first set of stitches across my first half of stitches, and I've sort of transferred the stitches obviously from one needle to the other, and now I'm going to just sort of reverse the process I did at first. I'm going to pull the needle out of the stitches I've just worked and push it back through the stitches I'm about to work, and then I have enough cable so that I'm sort of half on one end and half on the other, and they're maneuverable. The tips are nice and maneuverable. So I pull out a bit, and then again I'm always going to be pulling that first stitch a little tighter than I normally would, and I continue in my row of 1x1 rib. All the way to the end, and then that's my first row finished. And again, I'll have that little gap there. Not to worry, it'll close. I keep pulling it a little bit tighter than I normally would at the beginning and end of each round, and it'll disappear in no time. And that's how you start. That's your cast on. And What you want to do is knit your cuff after that. It's easy to make it longer or shorter, but easy as well just to follow the instructions as they're given for your first sock. And then after you have an idea about how the socks work, there's a lot of variations. We have some to show you here, as a matter of fact. I work the 1x1 rib, but in the guidebook there are some other options for rib and pattern stitches that you can work. This is a little mistake rib, which gives you a lot of really beautiful texture on that. There's all kinds of different options. This is a 2x1 rib. We have all different versions. We're going to keep it really simple, but once you've done that first sock, there's an infinite number of options and beautiful stitch patterns that you can apply to these kind of simple vanilla socks to make them quite interesting and always different. That applies also to the toe pattern. We're going to work the spiral toe pattern, which you can see an example of here. Looks a lot like the top of a hat, if you've ever knit a hat. But just as easily to make is the kind of classic toe wedge. We have an example here, which looks a little bit like that when you lay your sock out flat. There's so many options. It's like infinity patterns are available. We're going to stick to making the most basic vanilla sock we can. And so that means I'm working a rib pattern, 1x1 rib, and then I'm working plain knit on the leg and on the top of the sock. We are going to work a little pattern stitch, a little slip stitch pattern on the heel, and that's just going to add a little extra fabric in there for a place that gets a lot of wear and tear on a sock. But that is what we're going to make, and if you're following along with me, then in 3 or 4 weeks you too will have your first sock finished, and we're going to go through it step by step. So next time, join me for the heel flap.